Hello, and welcome to episode 139 of the PowerScore LSAT podcast. I'm Dave Kaloran in Napa Valley.
And I am Jon Denning in Los Angeles.
Jon, how are you feeling today?
I feel all right. A little fatigued, but I'm sure that's no news to anyone listening to this. And I'd certainly be the last one to complain to people listening to this. So, Dave, I'm doing great. How you doing?
I've got a cold, so I could be better.
All right.
It's of my own, making.
Yeah.
School season's back.
It is back, and you've been leaving the house with a little bit of regularity.
I have been, and of course my daughter brought back a cold, and then on Monday night I went out and saw a concert in Berkeley and added fuel to the fire. So my fault.
Tell us who you saw, because normally I would just let that segue into the music that we picked, but we didn't actually use the band for Monday this time.
No, we didn't. I saw Sports Team, which is an English band that's very small, and saw them at the Cornerstone Brewery in Berkeley, which is a really cool place. I really enjoyed it, and they're a cool band. I love the music, and they hang out afterwards, so I was able to do that. But the tie-in here, Jon, is interesting because the music that we chose for tonight, you specifically chose it as Green Day, which is another Berkeley band. So
I did not know that
connection.
Yeah, all right. Well, there you go. I did choose that. And anyone who knows that I've just chosen Green Day and what month it is can probably guess the song. It's that "Wake Me Up When September Ends," which is kind of how I am feeling very literally at the moment. So I just really would love a 2-week nap.
It's not even the 15th of September, and you already want it to end.
I know.
It's premature.
I know. I'm also kind of eager to get the score release on the 27th and on to hopefully bigger and better things in October and November. We'll get to all that as we go. We're also recording this in the middle of the day, which has influenced our drink choices, or lack of.
Yes, what are you drinking?
I have got a triple espresso. I'm doing battle with me here.
Not even like a double, you went full triple?
Yep, I went all three. I just pushed espresso until the cup filled up. What do you got?
Water.
All right. I don't feel quite so lame.
Well, I had a Monster Energy earlier in order to get some energy for this, but it's water. And on that auspicious note, let's get to it. Let's start talking about the LSAT world, do a little bit of a broad background of what's coming up, and then we'll be right into the September 2023 LSAT. So let's just do an overview, Jon, of where we're at with this kind of like September, October, November LSAT. Obviously, the September LSAT is now in the books as far as the main test administration. There is a makeup coming on Tuesday, the 19th, for those who had problems. But we got the October LSAT. The registration is closed. That closed on August 31st. But that test is coming up on Friday, October 13th and 14th. And then they added 2 more days, the 15th and 16th. So it's now a 4-day extravaganza. Scores come out in November. And then the November LSAT's now the same exact thing. And if you're taking an LSAT or you haven't signed up, you still can, because the registration for November closes on the 28th of this month. And that test goes from November 8th, 9th, and now they added the 10th and the 11th, if I recall correctly. And then scores come out before December 1st. And if you're applying to law schools, any of these 4 tests, August, September, October, and November, all can be used for the upcoming season, as can January, and they are still on the early side. So if you're thinking, I've missed it, I'm too late, you are not too late. This is probably going to be certainly one of the slowest, but maybe the slowest admission cycle in terms of decisions from law schools in history. With new rankings and just kind of like a lot of uncertainty. Yeah. So you are definitely still in the early group at this point if you're concerned.
Definitely. Let me make one quick clarifying point about those dates you mentioned for November. That test does indeed kick off on the 8th and runs the 8th, the 9th, the 10th, and the 11th. But the 8th is actually, get your head around this, it's a Wednesday. Yeah.
Yeah.
So November starts in the middle of the week and runs through Saturday, kind of weirdly. October starts at the end of the week and runs through the following, I believe, Monday. So again, some quirks to these next 2 and final 2 test dates of the year. Adding the days is a good idea. Why they did it somewhat haphazardly, I think. Anybody's guess. But that,
I'm sure it has something to do with prometric availability and all that, but I don't really care about that BS. Yeah. It's like, whatever. You didn't need 2 extra days in the first place. And nobody took it in this past Sunday, as we'll talk about in just a moment. But
Well, yeah, there we
Got
go.
complaints.
But that is, yeah, you and I both do. I think we're going to bite our tongue a few times through this episode. But that is what we have for October and November. So 4 days for each, but slightly different starting days.
Excellent. Obviously, if you're taking the LSAT, we've got some webinars coming up. So what's going on with those?
Well, there's one tonight, I think. If I'm reading calendars correctly, there's one that starts at 8 p.m. this evening. If this is out in time for you to get signed up for that, you hear about it here. Congratulations. It's on common flaws in logical reasoning, something that continue to really dominate in terms of frequency and oftentimes difficulty. This is really well worth attending. Even if all you can do is register and then check the recording afterwards, it's a good one tonight. So that's on the 13th, Wednesday, which is today. But of course, the one that you and I have our eyes, I think, most closely on is next Wednesday, September 20th, also at 8 p.m. Eastern, kicking off for our October and November Crystal Ball webinar.
Is that in a week, man?
Believe it or not, buddy. Believe it or not. So apparently I don't get to sleep till the end of September.
Oh, yay.
Yeah. It's going to be great. I can't wait to do it. I'm excited. We got some cool updates, especially now that September's in the bag and has taught us a few things. So join us next week if you can for that. Certainly it's going to be a big event.
Yeah, certainly with the predictions, it'll be a radical overhaul because a lot of what we predicted got used over the past two tests. So there'll be changes for sure. But I'm looking forward to doing it. I just didn't realize it was in a week. So I'm like, no rest.
These things sneak up on you, man. And then a little further out, a little less sneaky, on the 11th of October, there's one on Logic Games, specifically detailing how to understand and create templates, or worlds, as some people call them, in Logic Games. A really cool idea, a very powerful technique. You and I have covered it countless times through different episodes here, but definitely worth checking out, especially if you struggle with games. That's on, like I said, October 11th.
Absolutely. And a lot of people have asked me already, oh, are you going to do a mini ball, a mini crystal ball for the November LSAT?
You're getting that already?
Maybe.
My goodness.
Yeah, I've gotten that question already multiple times. People who are looking at November are like, is there something specific from me?
Yeah.
It depends on what happens in October. So I would say attend the October-November one. And again, if we do a mini ball, we completely change the format. It's not at all similar to the regular crystal ball. We probably would have done one here for September, but as we explained, I think in the prior episode, because of the problems with the test and all the additional retake dates, we ran out of time to be able to make it happen. And so I think there's a chance that we'll do one for November. I know you and I both like that format. It's like 45 minutes. It focuses very much on what has changed from the last one. It's kind of a fun change of pace for us. So if we can do it, I think we will do it. Whether or not for sure it happens depends on the test in October.
Yeah, totally. I did have a really good time with the one we did previously. And like you say, the reason we couldn't do one here for September is we literally lost a full week, if not more, to make updates.
2 weeks almost.
Yeah, all right. Yeah, because then we had to wait through the following week as well when there was a regular schedule.
Thursday makeup, yeah.
Right. So that was our window to do a mini ball for September, and unfortunately we just couldn't. Physically, that was impossible for us to do.
Yeah, and then I headed off to Vegas where I got my phone stolen. That was great.
I wonder how much sympathy you're going to get for that one.
I'll tell you something. Having your phone stolen in Vegas sucks. But all well now and moving forward.
Yeah, you should try it in Mexico City sometime. That was a real blast.
Yeah, it was probably even worse. Last time I checked, my phone was in West Covina, California. So we'll see what travels it currently takes, even though it's reported as lost and locked and everything like that. All right. All those kind of personal notes aside, let's talk about the September 2023 LSAT that just has come through the books and is in the main now over. And Jon, I'm going to start by breaking down a little bit of what we saw on the past weekend, just in terms of test taking numbers. And then we'll talk a little bit about some of the issues that we saw because we did see some issues. But you had the test on Friday, starting on the 8th of September. Probably about 6,500 people took that exam on Friday, and that was lower than what was originally expected. There was an issue on Friday morning that we'll get to in a moment. So that number was a little bit depressed down from what the expectation was. Saturday was a more normal day for them. That was about 8,200 people taking the test. And then Sunday, the day they added after they had all those August problems, is kind of like an overflow safety valve. That ended up being about 2,000 people. And interestingly enough, that Sunday test was largely very smooth for many people. And I think part of the reason was not that many people taking it. So that gives you about 16,700 actual test takers, not scheduled, but actual. And then there is a makeup coming on Tuesday, the 19th. That's for people who are retesting for significant technical or proctoring issues. There's several hundred of those people. So you'll be a little bit over 17,000 test takers for this exam when all is said and done. And of course, no matter when you take it, whether it was Friday, Saturday, or Sunday, or that makeup coming on Tuesday, 9/19, you still get your scores on Wednesday, the 27th of September. Everybody gets it at the same time, 9 a.m. Eastern time.
That's right. Yeah. So hopefully, if you're listening to this, you are done. If you're taking it next Tuesday, we wish you luck. And we say this each time, but I'll reiterate. The makeup test next week will be new content. So what we're going to cover here, as interesting as you may find it, if you're taking the makeup, you will not see any of this on your test. Partly that's why we're clear to do it and feel okay doing it. But I don't want people to get the wrong impression that they're going to get some sort of like preview here.
No, we're not talking about content that's yet to be used. That makeup retake is typically a different test here. So let's talk a little bit about this, because we know that August as an LSAT had severe problems and disruptions. They added 2 additional testing days the following weekend. They added a day in September, 2 days in October, and 2 days in November, a full extra week of testing, much to my personal regret. That all those options have now been added in there. It's good for test takers to have them. So the first question is in terms of overall problems, was September as bad as August?
Well, I think the fact that we're not doing a whole separate episode on the September issues is a pretty good clue. It seemed to be far, far smoother than August, which, again, I should put a disclaimer on that. It wasn't perfect. And we'll get into some of the specific issues that we saw in just a second. But compared to August, which was truly calamitous, this one seemed...
Worst ever.
Yeah. I mean, August is a poor one to compare it to, although it's the only one we have, because it was so bad. This felt much, much better. Even Friday and Saturday, the 2 big heavy days, felt a lot better than anything we saw in August.
Yeah, so we can confidently say this wasn't the worst ever. We've got an improved situation there.
I don't know what it's going to take to be the worst ever at this point, but
an absolute full-scale shutdown.
Yeah.
But what happened, though, that was really the big problem for this test? There's always minor problems, and Jon certainly is right in saying we're not discounting the issues that people had. And if you had an issue with the problem, it is huge. And it is frustrating, and I have deep sympathy, as many of the people that I spoke to over the weekend who wrote me about problems know. My first comment is always, I'm really sorry this happened.
Yeah.
I feel terrible about the fact that somebody's chance to really kind of like shine and show their ability is compromised in any way. And I can tell you, just having talked to the people at LSAC, the rank and file members there that I know, they feel the same way. They don't want you to have problems. So at least everybody's on the same page about wanting things to be better. But Friday morning, we had about a 20 to 25 minute outage that came through related to LawHub. And I don't know whether it was a problem with LawHub software. I don't know whether it was a Microsoft Azure problem. I don't know the actual cause. And of course, no one wants to talk about that. But when LawHub goes down, everything goes down, because LawHub is what they use to deliver the test. And that means whether you're practicing by yourself at home in preparation for a future LSAT, or whether you're in the LSAT itself, it goes down. And that meant that 2 things happened. People who were inside test sessions were kicked out. People who were waiting to onboard were typically kicked out as well. And that means you have to restart the entire process and try to get back in. And that is going to affect instantly hundreds of people. It depends on the time. Obviously, this was early. It was probably about 9 a.m. Pacific, right at 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific on Friday was where the issue came out. And then it creates a long chain. Immediately, their phone lines get flooded. There's a lot of complaints that come in. People start writing us and saying, what do I do? And typically, the solution on that is that you close your browser down entirely. You log out of Proctor and all that jazz, and then you log back in. It didn't work for everybody. Some people were getting error code 300.1, which, according to LSAC, was caused by not shutting the browser down first before trying to re-log in. So you have to shut that browser down. It's almost like a clear cache kind of situation. Yeah. But even when some people got back in, their confirmation code no longer worked. The only good thing was for many people, when they got kicked out, the test froze for them. And when they came back in, they were at the same point. So that was at least useful. And they were able to see about 3/4 of the people get back into the test eventually and continue on. That doesn't always happen. And in some cases in the past, people have been forced to restart their test. So there was some positives to the way this got handled. I will say this. I saw LSAC respond faster this time. Mm-hmm. They posted guidance relatively quickly on what to do. That is a marked change from what happened in August. So we saw improvements. But if you were part of that group that got kicked out, it was not good. It was awful and it was frustrating. And some of those people were the same people that got affected in August. So it was even worse.
Yeah. What was interesting about this too is it seemed to affect both remote people and people testing in person. Because again, when LawHub, the sort of cornerstone of their delivery system, goes down, it doesn't matter where you are or how you're testing, you're done, at least until it's back up. So yeah, this is the first time I think we've seen an issue that's that widespread regardless of test type. So not much you can do about that, unfortunately. We've made a lot of, I think we've been pretty strong advocates of try to take it on the lowest volume day. You and I both said we'd be Sunday test takers here in September. Turns out that was a good call. Try to take it in person. If there's a center available to you, there have been far fewer issues. But this was one of those things where it wouldn't have mattered what day or where you took it. It was just going to be a problem.
That's exactly right. And, the one silver lining here was that it was only 20 minutes. And unlike August, where there were systemic issues all over the place, LSAC was able to identify that it was happening with LawHub and immediately take action. And that was a really kind of important thing there for them to be able to address at that particular point.
Yeah.
Were there other problems?
I'd call that more of an aluminum lining, I think. Silver
fine.
Silver seemed strong.
It wasn't great, but it was something
it's better.
That moved it along more quickly.
Yeah, that's fair. You flagged one thing that I guess somebody reported to you. Something happened in Virginia at a test center, I think, that got a little bit of attention.
Yeah, in Falls Church, this happens. There was a power outage. Then, they had a Wi-Fi set of issues. We saw some of this. There were other locations as well that had minor problems. But again, because there were proctors there, they were able to freeze everything and then return them back into the system. And of course, John, once again, people reported widespread issues with that search bar that they have implemented at the top of the test. Control F is not something that is really viable at this point, and they want to replace it with this search bar, but that search bar it's not working well. It's glitchy. And so that's something they got to focus on, and I know they're aware of it. Yeah. We had some proctor issues too. There's always some issues with proctors, especially the face touching warning. I can tell you that they do now. I'm aware of the fact that they push guidance in the middle of the test to the proctors, you don't have to enforce these types of things. So they are working on it. They're well aware of these issues and some of the other related issues that we saw reported about proctors and comments they made and behavior. And they don't have a tolerance for it. But it has to happen first before they can then say, let's stop this. It happened in August, though. So I'm like, look, that's 2 shots now. We better not see this don't touch your face stuff in the next upcoming test, because anything that stops your momentum in the exam would infuriate me.
Yeah, especially something like that. My head's usually in my hands when I'm looking down at scratch paper or staring at the screen or something. So I know I would have been a pretty flagrant violator of this exact thing, and it would have frustrated me instantly. So
I'm always leaning my head on my hand, so it would literally be like, no, you shut up. I don't want to hear your proctoring. Get out of my face. All right. All that said, let's get to the discussion. And as usual, I'm going to run through a list of disclaimers. And those of you who haven't heard them before, please listen because they are, I think, relevant to understanding what we're about to talk about, why we talk about it, why we make certain predictions that we do. And the first reminder, as always, please don't summarize this online. Every time I look at Reddit afterwards, I see it on Twitter, and I'm like, please don't do it, because almost always we say there's nuance to this, and then the nuance is lost. It is something where I would just say, have people come listen to what we say. It won't take that long for them to get there. Another thing I'll remind people is that section order is meaningless. See, a lot of people saying, well, I had LR first, then RC, then LR, and then LG, and someone's like, I had the same test. It doesn't mean that. Mm-hmm. Could have been a different order. Could have been entirely different sections. The section order is irrelevant at this point. It's only useful for identifying the content that you had for you to remember it. A comment I'll make a little bit later. But they changed sections and orders and test content all day long, and they did that all through the 3 days of the weekend. As usual, you can talk about generalities and topics, and we're going to do that. We're not going to talk about specific solutions. We're not going to talk about specific answer choices because that is unfair and could be prejudicial to future test takers. All that LSAC asks, and it's really quite reasonable, is, hey, wait until the main testing is over. But I will remind everybody, if we don't eventually see something that somebody wrote about this, or if we don't hear from people, we can't talk about it and make predictions. So as we talk about what the content of this test was, we think we have the majority of it. But if we're missing anything, it's because we didn't hear from you. So if you don't hear your sections, let us know afterwards, because we are very interested in knowing what was used, what wasn't. Let's talk about difficulty for a second. When you take a practice test, it's not real. It's a real test that you've taken from the past, but the outcome isn't real. Your practice test score isn't recorded in Newtown, Pennsylvania, and then sent to law schools. And that means that when you sit down for the real one, the pressure is on. And for almost everybody, that real pressure makes everything darker, gloomier, less happy. It almost always feels worse taking a real LSAT than a practice test. And this negativity bias creeps in, and you see it after the test. That was the hardest LSAT ever, hardest logic games I've ever taken, worst reading comprehension I've ever had. Probably isn't. Certainly wasn't on this particular test. But at the same time, things are really tough. So when you go through a test like this, we know that it's hard. Every LSAT section is difficult. So if I say, hey, this section was easier than the other, I didn't say it was easy. I said it was easier. It is a relativity issue. And so ultimately, what we want you to remember is there's this bias that creeps into your recollections. That is normal. It probably wasn't as bad as you thought, even though it felt horrible at the time. Keep in mind also that test makers try to actively confuse you by placing similar topics in different sections. So you might think, I'm talking to this person about the same section, but you're not. You're just talking about one question topic in common. Classic example is we saw after one test, people talking about reading comprehension sections, and they had the topic that included the country of Nigeria. And people were like, yeah, I had the Nigerian passage. There were two different passages on Nigerian that were not the same and were in different sections. So don't automatically assume anything about topics, about order, all those types of things. This has been happening for a while. We know they do this. Keep in mind also that our estimations of real and experimental sections are based upon certain assumptions about reusage, and typically that if a prior section was scored, that it will not come back as an experimental section, it will come back as a real section. For some people, that probably is like, oh, I think I might know what's real now. So far, we have never been wrong about identifying a section as being real and it not being real as far as we're aware of, and that is based upon the sections they then released later on. And once again, it's possible you don't hear your section discussed, or you don't recall the questions that are mentioned. That actually happens more than you'd think. And they're limiting information online, so sometimes it can be really difficult to remember those types of things or to know if that's the same question. And the way people describe questions is very different. Was this a question about babies, or was it a question about sparkling water? Well, sometimes people are like, I can't remember which part of it was, or they don't describe it in the same way, so it can be hard to connect things. And then last, please don't summarize this online. Just send them to the podcast. And I'm going to give one more note, John.
Yeah.
That is new, and then we will break down the sections here. And this is advice for future test takers. When you finish that test and you ripped up your scratch paper and you hit submit, everything gets closed down, take a moment, write down for yourself. I'm not asking for it, but do this for yourself. Write down the sections you had in the test and what question topics you remember. Did you have a game about shipwrecks and reefs? Put that in there. Did you have a logical reasoning question about malaria or fireplaces and chimneys in apartment buildings? Write that down. The reason I would suggest doing that is because when you get to this point, when you're hearing the sections, your clarity on what order you had and what you remember will be far greater. And you'll be able to say, I had that section right here. What happens is after you wait a couple of days, it starts to just blur together. And you're like, was that LR question first section or was it my fourth section? And then it gets frustrating because you want answers. We're trying to provide them, but you can't remember. giving yourself a few notes goes a long way towards checking later on and saying, all right, was this section the one I had that was scored, or was this one experimental? So definitely do it for all 4 of the sections just to make sure, but focus especially on the section you had that was doubled, because that's where your confusion will be after the exam. And on that note, Jon, let's talk about the test.
Yeah, that's good advice. Back in the good old days of regular in-person testing, I used to always tell my students to keep a notepad or something in their car, so the second they left the test center, they could start to jot down every piece of detail and information they recalled. It's also a bit of a barometer, a litmus test too. The more you feel like you can recall after the test, this isn't a perfect measure, but it's usually a pretty good sign that you were dialed in, that you were locked into the content and engaged. So people who walk out of the test in some sort of fugue state and don't remember even taking it, those people worry me. This is a way that you can actually kind of get your head around what just happened.
Worry me is not perfectly evocative of how I feel about it. When someone comes back and says, I don't remember anything, I have real concern because it means that being in the moment might have been more of a challenge. When someone comes back and says, I remember this, 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 and this, I'm like, this is a great start. Usually it shows that you had control of the process. And just to add on to that, one of the things I always tell people to do during practice tests is to practice this. Mm-hmm. Write down the recall, check it. Also make a predicted score so that you can say, I thought I missed 3 questions here, 4 questions here, 2 questions here, and then track that over time. So that on the day of the actual test, you can go back and say, I have a track record for trying to figure out how well I did. Obviously, we try to supplement that with our information, but hopefully you can take all that you do and what we do and then come up with a pretty good feeling about where you're going to end up on the scoring.
Yeah, that's really good advice. Those practice tests are just a perfect opportunity to essentially calibrate your own self-assessment. If you find you're way too generous, way too generous, way too conservative with yourself, then the same will likely hold true for the real thing. So get it dialed in before you go take it. It's a big help.
All right, Jon.
And on that note,
extra minute.
Yeah. Let's talk the domestic September 2023 LSAT.
Yeah, and really there was no international test. That's coming up next month, so that'll be interesting. So they're all domestic for our purposes here. The big question that we always get immediately was the crystal ball anywhere close to being right? And I always say this, it's always a miracle that it even could get close to being right. And I know that you and I had grave concerns because we knew that the August test used additional test forms that we did not plan on them using in August. We knew we didn't have time for September to do a mini ball. So we were like, look, we know the generalities of it are good, but how do we do on some of the specifics?
Yeah, let's talk about those specifics, and then I'll actually reference a Reddit post that I saw today. I think that's really relevant to this discussion too. I think you and I were both maybe a little concerned or anxious about how well our predictions for September would hold up after the just debacle in August and them adding that many new tests and test days, because that really did kind of throw a wrench in things, at least potentially. So I was very gratified and pleased, I know you were too, to see one of the tests that we had suggested would come up get used first thing Friday morning. And I'm referring specifically to the November 2021 LSAT. That was a test we had talked about having partial use already, but there was some new content from it. And it was that new content, all 3 sections, that got used Friday and then throughout the long weekend as well, repeatedly. So I was very, very pleased to say that, again, we have gotten this right. All the way down, as we'll talk about, to like specific reading comp topics, Herbert Butterfield and things.
And let's address the idea of getting it right, because is our goal to get every single section predicted for every single test taker? Well, yeah, sure, that's our goal. Is it realistic? No. I've said this before. Even predicting one topic on the LSAT is an incredible feat to me. I feel like we're living in this glory age that is hard for people to necessarily understand, because I can't see a world 10 years ago where I could have even done this once. Would not have been possible. We're living in a unique period of time where there's so many tests, they're forced to reuse so many tests that we can actually get a sense in many instances of what they might do. Won't last forever. It never existed before. But while we're living in it, let's take advantage of it. So to even get one topic right and to maybe direct people towards that is amazing. But we're under no illusion that we're going to predict every single reading comp topic. And I hope no one else out there listening is. When we get anything right, I'm immediately thrilled beyond belief. And as we know now, from Friday morning, we were getting things right. And so I just want to make sure everyone understands what the idea of getting it right is. As soon as we hit one of anything, I'm like, victory. I'm willing to declare victory. And we had more than that. So I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, this was a full test's worth of right starting Friday. And again, I'm tempted to read the feedback that I saw on Reddit today about the crystal ball itself.
Do it.
Because it added a second point here that often gets overlooked, which is the recommended problem sets as well. This isn't just about...
It resonated with me.
Yeah, me too. So, all right, if you'll indulge a quick reading, I'm just going to quote this user on Reddit from this morning, and we can track down this thread later if anybody's interested. And it starts and ends on two things that both made me kind of chuckle. The beginning line was, "I have no idea how I did on this test," which I thought was an honest start. Could have gotten anywhere from 163 to 177, but if you aren't watching the crystal balls, you're just putting yourself at a disadvantage. My RC topics were exactly, all caps, what I studied because of what Jon said that they would likely reuse. Just think about the fact I read about some random dude named Herbert Butterfield, and it was reused on my exam. I went to the passage knowing who and what he believes. When there was a line I normally wouldn't have understood, I did understand because of the prep. The problem sets they recommend, and this is where it gets good, are incredible, as a game I practiced was so similar to one of the harder games. And then again, all caps, it is free. If you haven't signed up for October, November, please do so. The worst that can happen is you learn something new. The best that can happen is the fact that you're at an immense advantage going in. And then it closed with this nice note. I'm rooting for myself and everyone. So it's hard to top that in terms of not just praise, which obviously feels great, but I think insightfulness too, that it's, you recognize a passage topic and you've got some familiarity with it. That is an advantage, full stop. But to be able to practice things that then reflect on the actual content that you see, to go and do a game that's similar enough to a real one and a hard one that you see and feel comfortable because of that, that to me is really where a lot of the gold in these crystal balls is. Those recommended problem sets are designed to do exactly what this person experienced.
Yeah, and this goes back to, as well as like when it works, it's fantastic. Yeah. Now, what happens to the person who's like, well, I didn't have those RC topics, or I didn't have a game that felt comfortable? Were you hurt by listening to it or doing that practice? No, because the general principles are still there. You might say, well, I didn't have a game like the one they did. Yeah, you did. You had linear games. You had advanced linear games. You had grouping, for example. You had LR that had abstract and broad general similarities to what you were dealing with. So there's no downside. That to me is what I think about when I look at the crystal ball is there can be incredible upside, but there is zero downside to it. Is it the only thing you should be studying? No. We never want you to do that. I want you to study as many LSAT questions as possible. Do I want you to do the recommended problem sets? Absolutely. But I want you to go beyond that as well. It is a tool. It is a supplement. It is an addition. It is not the main form of prep.
Right.
If it was the main form of prep, I think we'd be charging for it. It's free. So it is something that we do because we think it's a public service and we want to make it available to everyone. We want everyone to have this advantage. Jon, my goal, your goal is for everyone to get a 180. We know that's not going to happen, and the test would probably change if it started to look that way, but that's still our goal. I want everyone to succeed, whether you are a PowerScore student or not. And if you sit in the crystal ball, I consider you to be a PowerScore student. You come on our forum, you're a PowerScore student to me, even if you haven't paid us a dime. It's not about the money, it's about the help.
Yeah, just listening to this, you're one of us.
Yeah. That's exactly how I see it. This is a big community. It's not about paying anybody. It's about we all want to get better. We all want to improve our scores, go to better law schools, have better outcomes, have better futures. So if I can help you do that, I'm happy to do it in any way possible. And I know you feel exactly the same.
I do, although also pay me. But I agree with your point.
Well, you're going to get paid by the company one way or the other. We do this because it's fun and it's really useful. And probably the most gratifying thing I do is talk to students, and especially when people are like, that really helped. I can't tell you how good that makes me feel. And I felt really great this weekend, aside from those people who had problems with the test, and there were more than a few. So let's get to it, though, because I'm sure most people are like, would you just talk about the test? Like, yes, I will.
All right. We'll start with games, as we always do, and I've already alluded to this, so Dave, I'll just go ahead and jump right into what we saw first thing Friday morning. The first set of real logic games that we saw, 23 questions, and again, these come from the November 2021 LSAT. It's the first place we saw them. Reused here, and these were the four games. There was a game about 6 film editors ordering a documentary and scenes in a documentary. A game about professors in the classes that they were teaching or lecturing on popular music, linguistics, sociology. Tricky game about senior vice presidents overseeing juniors. There was a president, a junior vice president, senior vice president. Maybe the hardest game in the section, probably so. But the 4th game was no slouch either, which was about a roadside assistance by a plow company and 2 workday schedules, Wednesday and Thursday. So really the 3rd and 4th games in that section were tough. But those were real. If you saw those Friday or at any point, it counted.
Yeah, and with games, we know that everything that people saw ended up being real. 'Cause if I recall correctly, as has been the pattern now for a while, there were no experimental logic games because we don't think they're creating them anymore because the section will change next year. Different topic. We've podcasted on that before. All right, so that was one real section. Definitely a lot of people complaining about the senior and junior VP, president stuff, and the roadside assistance there. So we know that section had some challenges to it. There was another section that was seen by a lot of people. How'd that one go?
This was a new section. I think this started to really make heavy appearances on Saturday morning. So Friday was mostly the one I just talked about. And then we saw some new ones, maybe Friday afternoon, but certainly Saturday. 23 questions as well, and it contained these 4 games. And again, these are new. We didn't see these as a reuse. There was a game about a scuba diver visiting 4 of 8 tourist attractions. This was the diving thing, bay, reef, seashore. A lot of people called this a shipwreck game, but I think that was just one of the attractions. It was a game about order of antiques, mirror, quilt, javelin, various things being sold in an auction. Radio show slots and hosts from 1 to 6 p.m., and then artist pieces, or their artwork, going into 4 different or specific galleries or exhibits. I think there were 8 artists in that game.
Yeah, pairs of 2.
That's right. So again, a tough section. One of the big complaints I heard about these 4 was that it was just really time consuming. You just didn't get like a efficient break here with one of the 4. Well, you could do it in 5 or 6 minutes and kind of stock some time. All of these really were a challenge in terms of speed.
Yeah, and this section is also interesting in the sense that most sections start off fairly low key. A game that's like 6, things going into 6 places. So much to the extent that a lot of times people can't remember what the first game is. They're like, I just went and did it. This section is not like that. This section starts off with probably the hardest game first, which is a real off-putting kind of thing. Because you think, well, I can do this. The setup looks good. And then all of a sudden it takes longer and longer. And then none of the other games in this section were like slam dunks. So I think the structural nature, you look at the first section we talked about, games 3 and 4, probably the real killers there. Here, all of them have difficulty, but there's some real difficulty right out of the gate. And when that happens psychologically, that's disturbing for people because you're expecting to have a fast start and then you don't. Keep in mind that when that happens, you have to think to yourself, all right, they're going to readjust this section, hopefully, so that I'm not seeing something else later on that's as of high difficulty. Should be easier on the back end, relatively speaking. But this was a time-consuming section, and I really would like to see what an antique javelin looks like. But aside from that,
it's funny to me that that's what caught your eye in all of this. Now that you mentioned it, yeah, I'm curious too. An antique quilt.
I'm not an antique guy. This all sounds like trash to me. Quilt, javelin, mirrors and tables. I'm like, all right, mirrors and tables are kind of standard antiques, but I suppose quilts are probably worth a lot if they're old, but it just sounds like something moldy in the closet.
Yeah, I just think of smallpox. But I look at this, what a terrible auction.
Who wants the javelin? Like, specialize what you're doing with your antique sale here. This auction. All right,
as we go through this and talk about some of the quirks and strangeness, one of the things that really struck me, and probably you too, was that there was a 3rd section of games, and one that I didn't really see coming, if I'm honest.
Yeah.
23 questions again, a real section that we know. What surprised me here is this was a reuse of the February 2018 content, a test that has been reused multiple times over the years. It's not their favorite February test, but we saw this in one of the early flex tests, January of 2021. We saw this in October of 2022 internationally. We saw this test November of 2022 as one of the makeups. And we got it again here. It's hard to say how many people saw this or if it was maybe constrained to a single test type like paper and pencil. I know the people that I heard from that saw this had paper and pencil tests, but they may not be the only ones.
Yeah, because some paper and pencil people had a different test, one of the former two. This test was not used as widely. It was, and we'll kind of talk about it a little bit separately. It was used with all the other February 18 scored sections. It seemed like it was a single set. So there won't be too many people out there who are like, I had this section, but for those of you who did, we've got you covered.
Yeah. So here we are to cover you. These 4 games are the ones we're referring to. The first game was about student seating arrangements. Game 2 was lectures in an upper and lower lecture hall or lecture halls. Game 3, my favorite, I think, of the bunch, was guards doing an investigation of noises and things, different events in a museum, lights on and off, people entering, noises and things. And then finally, it concluded with a game about students taking economic classes in various types of specialties, international, labor, urban. But again, I think as soon as you or I saw a game about the guards investigating museum events, immediately we knew what test it was. And immediately I was struck by the fact that that's odd. Why would they feel the need to use that?
I think this is a real limited use, but we've memorialized it. We now know they did use it. Yep. I think we're good there. And again, no experimental that was floating around on the logic game side. So everyone should have had one of those 3 sections. If you didn't, tell us, send us a message and be like, no, I had this other section. Or if you don't remember which section you had or it's not standing out, obviously go back and think, did I have something about a roadside assistance or a trucking plow company, that kind of thing. Try to break it down internally. Let's move on to RC.
Yeah. Which easily enough to start, because this also was from that November 2021 test that we predicted for potential reuse. 27 questions. We saw these Friday morning and then throughout the weekend as well. These 4 passages were real. Passage on Native American autonomy and sovereignty, I think specifically in relation to a UN document and treaty. Tough passage to start with. It was a passage about work hours and capitalism, consumerism, consumption, and labor, referred to a woman named Juliet Shore. Passage that a lot of people talked about because it was so recognizable from the crystal ball about Whig history. Whig is in the, political group, not the fake hair. But this is where you...
H-I-G.
That's right. This is where you saw Herbert Butterfield come in, and the people who had done some reading about Herbert were certainly grateful for it. So kudos to the crystal ball there. And then finally, it wrapped up with another tough passage about hydrogen fuel cell cars and eventually replacing carbon-based cars. That Herbert Butterfield Whig history was comparative, by the way.
Yeah, and when we do the next crystal ball, we'll show the prior predictions and the places where we talked about like the hydrogen stuff and the Herbert Butterfield, just to kind of show like, wow, that was actually a pretty good selection there. Not an easy section though. Once again, some real challenges in here. We've seen this with a lot of reading comprehension recently, but then they threw in another section, John, that was new. In terms of its overall usage, although it had elements that we've seen before.
Yeah, I thought you were probably about to make that comment. The thing that jumped out to me in this section is that one of the passages was on a topic that we have seen recently as an experimental passage. This time, though, it was real. You and I are both referring specifically to a passage about Outkast, the rap group from Atlanta, and how they were different because they incorporated funk and kind of electronica into their music. Again, an interesting passage, real this time, though. So if you had a section with Outkast, that section counts. It also had passages on universal grammar with Noam Chomsky, whether language is innate or not, and adaptationists. There was a passage in there about expert witnesses and juries. That was the comparative passage. And then finally about cost-benefit analysis versus principle procedure on environmental policies. A tricky passage for a lot of people as well. Those, as you mentioned, are all new, so these were not a reuse from a previous test, although that Outkast passage possibly.
It looks like the Outkast passage possibly was used a couple of years ago, and then they pulled it out. And we've seen passages on Noam Chomsky before. I look at this and I think to myself, Outkast, I can totally read about that. Andre 3000 and Big Boy, this is right up my alley. I like music. I would enjoy it. Expert witnesses. Sounds fine to me. I understand the legal system. Feel good if you're going to law school. That's got to be something you're interested in reading. Cost-benefit analysis. All right, they can make that interesting. Grammar, Chomsky, and adaptationist sounds terrible to me. And I heard a lot of people complain about this passage, and obviously I haven't read it, but I can only imagine it's terrible. It's probably a real slog to get through. So I have mixed feelings about this section because I see some good stuff from a topical standpoint. And what I know of the difficulty is there's some elements here that are favorable. And then there's this terrible, unfavorable passage in there as well that I know I personally would hate reading. I'm not a Chomsky fan in terms of just reading his stuff. So Who knows?
Yeah.
This is a mixed bag with this passage. We'll come back to it. But we also had one more reading comp passage that paired with that logic game section about the guards investigating the noises in a museum. What was that section?
Before we get to it, I'll make one final point about the previous thing. And it's a quick point, but it tickles me a little bit. Usually when we start to see passages, multiple passages on multiple tests on the same subject matter, it means that LSAC has contracted some sort of expert to contribute and submit these kind of materials, which leads me to believe that somewhere out there, there's an outcast expert who continues to write RC passages for LSAC. Something about that just kind of makes me giggle. I like that.
Well, there's been another rap. I think they're mining that more cultural thing. You and I have talked about this, articles on the Golden Girls, these kinds of things where it's like they're doing some more current cultural references or recent cultural references. But if you were a higher education outcast expert, that sounds like a pretty cool job.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I want to meet that person. I don't know who wrote about Noam Chomsky, but they can keep to themselves.
You want to be the higher education Led Zeppelin expert or something like that.
Happily.
What was that third section?
Yeah, no Led Zeppelin this go round, unfortunately, but there was one more set of passages. These also come from that February 2018 test, as Dave mentioned, where you had the guards in the museum for the games. The 4 passages here, 27 questions again. There was a passage on Elaine Locke, Harlem Renaissance leader, African-American adult education. Passage on beetle larvae and being protected from ants by cottonwood trees. Seems kind of interesting. Passage on, I think I'm saying this right, maybe not, Cicela Bach. Does that sound right to you, Dave? Yeah.
Yes, it does.
Her theory on lying and democracy. And then I think it's her. And then finally, arguments for and against lengthening copyright laws on books. This had to do specifically with like English copyright law in Parliament. And that was the comparative passage to end the section.
And all those passages, I think, were 27 questions, the sections at least. There was an experimental that was floating around as well, so why don't we kill off the experimental for reading comp while we're at it?
Yeah, everything we've talked about so far with these passages were real. If any of those ring a bell, that section counted. If any of these that I'm about to mention ring a bell, this section was unscored. 27 questions, primarily paired up with the Outcast passage set. And there were these 4 passages. There was one about the Islamic Golden Age of medicine. There was a comparative passage about uncertainty in laws, a passage about possums playing dead and how it shows the minds of predators, and finally a passage on chess and whether we can actually play ourselves in our head, whether that's a fair way to do it. So, again, it only takes one. If any of those match your recollection, that section is unscored, and you can ignore it as we go forward.
All right. Let's move on to LR because obviously we're coming down to the matrix.
Yeah.
And you've just taken the load with logic games and reading comprehension. So I will throw in some of the LR. And what we're going to do here is we're not going to focus on experimental sections. We know there were experimental sections out there. We've identified a lot of the questions in them, but it can be really confusing. I have a lot of sympathy for the double LR people. You know who you are out there. It's really tough to remember which question was in which section. Even when people are like, all right, this is what I think, we see mistakes kind of cross over, like misattributions very consistently. So don't blame yourself if like this sounds confusing. What we're looking for is trying to figure out if you had 2 LR, where you can identify some of these questions from it. Was it your first section? Was it your third section? Was it your fourth section? If you can confidently say that some of these questions were in a particular section, you know that they are real. So let's start off with the section that reflects what came from November 2021, the same LG and RC that were widely used starting on Friday morning. This was a section with 26 questions. Probably the most notable question in there is about domesticating wild Bezoar goats and kind of like the Fertile Crescent and all that. But there's other questions in that same section about malaria treatment funding, sperm whales, attacked by orcas, kind of like the North Atlantic and the Pacific working together, coal mining and electricity, kind of like a popular startup called Zyfam, another question about parking lots and buildings, birds that are flying long distances, sleeping while flying, wasps recognizing the faces of other wasps, gurus, and walking on hot coals. Those are a good selection of the questions that are in that particular section. If you had those questions, they are scored. If you can remember which section they were in, then you know that was your overall scored section. And this is why I said earlier, hey, in the future, if you're taking this test, make notes right afterwards. Because you might be like, I had a weird question about goats. All right, that was in section 1. That's your scored section, and you're off to the races if you can add a few of the other points here. Also saw another scored section widely used, and this is one that had, I think, 25 questions, if I recall correctly. Probably the most notable and widely talked about question was about decaffeinated coffee beans and how it affects taste. There was a question about apartments with fireplaces and fire escapes. I actually mentioned that earlier. Atherosclerosis. Am I even saying that right, John?
Yeah, you nailed
it. You're the more medical expert. Effective weight loss programs. A question that also came up a lot about adding seasoning or salt, particularly to meals being made by good chefs. Question about logging. Questions about grammar errors in ancient tomes. And then replacing original works of art with imitations. All those were real as well. So if you had those, you can identify, you know that section was scored. There was a third scored section that we're aware of that pairs with those February 18 test takers. So if you were a person out there who had the game about the guards investigating the museums, and then the reading comp with Elaine Locke, Cecile Bach, and the Parliament copyright, you probably had this logical reasoning section. It involved increased drug testing and bike racing in Europe. Hello, Lance Armstrong. Ankle injuries from wearing XYZ shoes, foreshock, and earthquakes, which is a rather unfortunate topic given what has happened worldwide in the last week or so. Question about baby talk. And then finally, another question about nuclear submarines being used for power at military bases. Most people had that as the full Feb 18 scored sections. Again, we don't think there were too many of them, but that was another scored section. And to avoid confusion, we're not going to start naming experimental question topics because we found in the past that just makes things harder to actually discern. And that's ALR.
There you go. Yeah, so it seems to me, in doing a quick just back and napkin math here, it seems there were 3 scored sections of each type. Although certainly one of those scored sections in each type, the February 2018, by far the least common.
And paired all together.
Uh-huh.
So you'd think, well, there's 27 possible combinations. It doesn't look like that. It looks like there were really 8 major combinations and then another test form that was used to some greater or lesser extent. And again, we think that's all. That's what we heard. We're comfortable with all those sections that we identified as being scored. If anyone did happen to have something different, like we said, let us know. Find us on Twitter, find us on Reddit, send us an email, and let us know. Because again, if we don't hear from you, we can't talk about it. And input makes a difference here. The quality of what we get on the front end affects the outcomes that we're able to talk about.
Yeah, not just in terms of topic, but also in terms of what we're about to do, which is the scaling predictions.
Fantastic. So this is the point where a lot of people just pop right in. I would say, yes, don't jump to this particular point. Go back and listen to the discussion of what is real and what is not. But I'm going to run through this scaling matrix. And again, these are predictions. Historically, we've been very accurate with our predictions, which we feel great about. We've been doing this a long, long time. We have a lot of information about these sections, the games, the answers, the rules, all those types of things floating around from years of doing this. And the way it works is this. We take a look at an LSAT and we start with what we call a baseline score in terms of the number of questions you can miss to obtain a 170. And that baseline start is that you can miss 7 questions to get a 170. And this is based upon prior analysis of scales, all sorts of historical things that we've looked at. Then we talk about each section, and we say either that section doesn't move the scale, so it stays at 7, it tightens it, so it might move to 6, or maybe it loosens it, so it goes to 8, and there's some nuance inside these as well. So what you should do if you are a listener is kind of listen through and say, all right, start at -7, and then when we hit each section, we give you the adjustment, and then you move your scale. Stays at 7, goes to 8, what have you. So one final word is that we're always conservative. If we're on the borderline between how a section would be moving, we always take the conservative estimate. And that is because we'd rather have people come out with higher scores than they expected than lower scores than they expected. And being conservative actually works to that advantage. So all that in mind, let's take a look at what we had from Logic Games. All right, starting with the logic game section that was reused from November 2021. This was the film editors, professor lectures, the famous president, senior, junior, VP, and then lastly, the workday schedule with the plows. This section, we've talked about it before in the past, this loosens the scale by 1. So good news for those of you who had that, you get a little bit of a bonus. So if you're at 7, you move to 8. That is also going to happen with the new section that dealt with like the shipwrecks and the diving and all that, the antiques, including the ridiculous javelin and quilt, the radio show hosts, and the art pieces in pairs, 8 being put into 4 galleries in pairs. This section, you and I, John, have debated it. I think it is time-consuming enough and the hard start throws people off enough that it too moves the scale by 1. So if you had that section, you go from 7 to 8. Also 23 questions there, as all these LGR. And then last, if you had the February 2018 section with the seating, the lecture halls, the museum burglary, and the sounds, and the economics prerequisites, that section, when we've talked about it before, we've said that it's really a 0.5. We think the section is reasonable, and so at a 170, it's not going to move your scale. But that 0.5, what that means, if you've never heard it before, is that as you go down scales, you move towards, say, 165 and 160, it will loosen your scale. So you get a benefit from the difficulty in that section at, say, the 160 level, but you don't get that benefit at 170, and that is because at 170, the expectation is you're great. You're not missing questions, and the section's not hard enough to cause you to miss a lot of questions. So everybody is either at 8 or really what I would call 7.5, and then you have to assess where you are in terms of your scoring. If you're scoring 160, it's a bonus for you. If you're scoring 170, it's not.
Yeah.
All right. Catch a breath. It's funny, John. You and I love doing this. So sometimes it's a culmination of literally, I'd like 100 hours of work for us. It all comes down to just like a couple minutes. Reading comprehension. So let's start here. Let's start with that November 2021 section with the Native American autonomy, the work hours, the wigs, and Butterfield, the hydrogen cars. This section, not the easiest. We've talked about it before, and it loosens the scale by 1. So again, if you had logic games of the first 2 sections and you now had this, you've gone from 7 to 8 to now 9. So you're looking pretty good at that point. You're getting a scale on the looser side or towards the looser side. Let's go to that Outcast passage with obviously the rap group Outcast, the Chomsky grammar adaptationists, the expert witnesses and juries, and then the cost-benefit analysis. Boy, this section really, really bothered me in terms of assessing the overall difficulty, because I think some of the passages aren't too bad, and then I think certainly one or more is kind of challenging. We're going to call this 0.5 as well. So at the 170 level, it's not going to change, but as you hit, I think probably 165 at worst, it's going to loosen up that scale. And, you know, this is a tough call. I know that certainly some people said to me, this was an easy section. Others were like, this was super hard. And when you get that kind of spread, it's very difficult for us, I think, John, to figure out exactly what the movement is. And that makes us think that it's going to be tighter at the top and then looser as you go down. You may disagree, though.
No, in fact, I'm happy to report that I'm in complete agreement with you and have no notes.
Excellent. Let's go to the last passage that was used. Again, this is the February 18 people who would have had typically the museum burglary questions. Maybe not everybody, but most of them. This was the passage set on Elaine Locke, the beetles and the larvae with the trees, lying, as well as copyright. Another hard section. This moves the scale by 1. So for a lot of people, they're either at, say, 8.5 or 9, somewhere in that general vicinity at this particular point. And let's finally close it out with logical reasoning. Again, starting with that November 21, bees or goats, the sperm whales, malaria, parking, buildings, the coal and electricity. This is not going to move the scale. I realize there are always hard questions in logical reasoning, but were there so many and that they were so difficult that it all of a sudden is expected to change? No. And it's an interesting point to say this. Their ability to control difficulty in logical reasoning is much better than it is for logic games and reading comp, because they are controlling 25 or 26 things. So they can make minor adjustments. In logic games and reading comp, because it's based around 4 main ideas, a little bit harder for them to do that, which is why with a lot of logical reasoning, you end up having kind of a null effect. Let's go to the next set. This was the decaffeinated coffee beans, the apartment fireplace and fire escapes, the atherosclerosis, the salt, the weight loss, the logging, also 0. And then last section, this was the one that was paired up with the museum burglaries, a lane lock, and so forth in most cases. This was bike racing and kind of doping, drugs, the shoes, the XY, the foreshock and earthquakes, the baby talk, also 0. All these LR are 0 effect. So you're looking at a lot of 8, 8.5, and 9 type of outcomes that you would see in this from a scaling at the 170. And again, that is the number of questions you can miss to get a 170.
Which should make people fairly happy. -9 is not a terribly common prediction for us to make, but there was some genuine difficulty out there, especially something you don't always see, which was the games. I think the games here loosening the scale in both instances for at least the lectures, the senior, junior vice presidents, and then the one about the shipwrecks. We haven't seen a whole lot of that kind of difficulty in recent tests. So hopefully it didn't beat people up too bad and they can just take advantage of the looser scale.
Yeah, and I'll make 2 comments. One is, again, about that outcast Chomsky RC. Some people would be like, fight me on this. And I'll be like, no, I won't fight you. I can understand that being 1 at the 170, but we told you we were going to be conservative. And if I'm not certain about it and I feel like it's on the line, I got to go with the more conservative side on this because I don't want to give any false hope. But could somebody convince me of it? Probably. I think it's debatable, and that's exactly our point about being conservative. When it is debatable, we're happy to do it. By the way, this is the nuance I'm talking about.
Right.
When I'm like, don't just tell people it's 0 at 170. There's more to it than that. I also feel like with some of the LR, one of the sections has a real strange, a whole bunch of justify questions in it. For example, what justifies what we call sufficient assumption. For some people, it's great. I love justify questions. I think, there's a real good way to attack them. I'm very comfortable with it. Not everybody is.
Right.
So all of a sudden, that could have really affected some people more than others. This is the casino effect. So if somebody's like, no, that was the worst LR, I understand them saying that. I also know that our job isn't to predict how it affects one person, but to try to predict how it affects the group, the collective. And so again, I could see arguments here being like, well, that LR might have been 0.5, but we're going to go conservative again and keep it at 0. That's worked really well for us historically, and I'd rather be on that side, at least LSAT-wise.
Yeah, exactly. There was another aspect to one of these LRs as well. I think it was the decaf coffee and the apartment fireplaces, etc., that we have as a 0 right now. But one of the interesting aspects of it, kind of like you mentioned before with a lot of justify questions, is that apparently there were several difficult questions earlier than usual within the first 10. And again, for a 170 type of test taker, that shouldn't really pose much of an issue because you start more or less on the ball and ready for anything. But it definitely becomes a little bit punitive down in the 160s or 150s, which is, again, where you would probably see more of an effect from that. So
exactly,
little things like that are so subtle and really do hit differently as you move up and down the scale. Back to the nuance point that you made before, Dave.
Yeah, and ultimately we use 170 as the marker because a lot of people are shooting for that. It's obviously a high line score, but it's also easier for us to see that top line difficulty in terms of analyzing these tests afterwards. It is much harder for us to see the mid-level difficulty. So this is why we don't predict scales typically at 160 and 150 because it's like, how much is that actually moving it? There's a limit. John and I have said many times that when we're confident with things, we will say what we think. If it's murky or it's indeterminate, we'll say that too, and we won't make a prediction about it. And that's exactly why we don't put a scale out for 150 on these tests. It's a lot harder to predict that than it is to predict the scale for 170. So the good news, at least on all of this, is that we'll find out for sure, at least in terms of scores, on Wednesday, the 27th of September at 9 a.m. This test is unfortunately non-disclosed, so we won't see these scales. If we see them, it'll be next year, the year after. Most everybody listening to this will be long gone in terms of having moved on from the LSAT. Jon and I will avidly study, the predictions at that point. And when we've been able to do this in recent years, it's come out really well. So we hope this was helpful. But on the 27th, you will get your score one way or the other, and then we'll have some final answers at that point. Jon, any additional comments?
Just one, which is a congratulatory note to all you brave souls who still went into September, head held high, even after seeing what happened in August. I felt, interestingly enough, kind of like a proud dad for a lot of the people that I saw kind of, they laced their shoes back up, they got back in the ring and went another round with this thing. And that's extremely commendable. And like I said, it made me very proud. And anyone listening to this who that applies to, you should be proud of yourself as well.
Yeah, and those of you who ran into problems this time, you have my sympathies. A lot of you are coming up here on the 19th. I wish you the very best. Please let us know how that goes. We've got our fingers crossed for you. I talked to a number of people who had issues during the test, and a lot of the attitudes that I heard were, the frustration, they're ridiculous, but also this kind of like brave resignation of like, I'll overcome this.
Yeah.
And I admire that. We're wishing you the best as you go forward. And on that note, if you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you may find it. And if you've enjoyed it, please leave a comment and rating as well. And if you have any questions, you can send those to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. On behalf of Jon, I hope that you have enjoyed this podcast. We hope that it is useful. Let us know what you thought. And until score release on the 27th, stay safe out there. We'll talk to you soon.